Victoria, I'll just start by saying a big thank you for agreeing to give us some of your time this Friday, the 20th of December. I think you and I have just mentioned that it feels like everybody's sort of closing down for Christmas. There's a real sense of that this morning, and I'm glad that we've found this time to have a conversation. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much, Charlie. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you guys for inviting me.
Excellent stuff, Victoria. And just for everybody's sort of clarity around things, those that are watching the video, we do have a couple of cats possibly on today's show. So if and what are the cats' names, Victoria?
Pizza and noodle.
Pizza and Noodle. Absolutely brilliant. What fantastic names for your pet cat. So if Pizza and Noodle show up, those are some additional stars of today's show and ones to look out for. But let's move on, Victoria. As you well know, first sort of 20 minutes or so, really keen to get to know you and share your kind of story with our audience. Start wherever you like. I mean, we do have some guests that literally go back to, formative childhood experiences and others that start a little bit later into adult education and the earliest part of their career. But start wherever you like. Giving our audience a flavor of who you are, and particularly focusing on the role that corporate ethics, responsibility, and sustainability has played in you, deciding to do what you've done with your career thus far.
Cool. So I think I would like to start with the fact that I didn't grow up being nature loving or very interested in climate change, right? Because climate change for me was always somebody else's problem. I was before I co-founded this company that I can talk a little bit about later on. I was in advertising, as a marketing and advertising for about 12 years, and I grew up actually in Singapore, but now I'm living in Germany, and then I've been living in Germany for about 13 years now. And Singapore, I don't know whether you've been there, is very green, right? Yeah. It's very green, but it's like a garden. It's not like a wild place. And if I would characterize it, it's still very much a concrete jungle. And back then, when I was growing up, I hated going outdoors. I dislike nature because in the tropics, essentially nature just means mosquitoes and sunburn. So a lot of mosquitoes in the wild. So, nobody was really a big fan of going outside, right?
Okay.
And, as I graduated from uni, I was studying marketing and corporate communications. And marketing people really thrive in environments that is filled with new, shiny things, which is very much what Singapore is all about. And for the longest time, I had an incentive to maintain status quo, to look away. And, we learned about climate change already back in school. So from a very young age, I knew that this was something that was existing and that it could eventually be a problem, right? But it was always somebody else's problem. And I always had this idea, this misguided idea that there's always somebody who's smarter, somebody who has more political power, somebody who's more passionate, and they will eventually make the problem go away, right? And I think many people really can sympathize with that. And then I came to Europe. I started doing a lot more things outdoors, partly because European climate is a bit more temperate. You don't get that many mosquitoes. And but I would say it would be another 10 years before this attitude really changed. So the turning point for me was during the pandemic. And it was not really, it was not like the turning point was actually very, very much coming from a point of self-preservation. It was not like, as the pandemic hit and I had like, like inspiration about what life should be. No. The pandemic hit and people started panic buying and people were preparing for lockdown. I was thinking about the situation and thinking about how I could safeguard my future, my family's future. And one thing that came into my head was, if there is no food to buy in a supermarket, how am I going to get food? So I was like, I need to learn how to garden. I need to learn how to grow my own food, right? Just so that I can prepare for the worst case scenario It could be a pandemic. It could be a zombie apocalypse. You know, I want to be able to survive this, and I want to be self sufficient in a way. So I started doing lots of research on how I can grow an unreasonable amount of food in a tiny little space. So that is really my starting point. And because of this, I started looking into gardening techniques. I started looking into different organisms, different plants, different insects, and learning really about the balance of our ecological system, right? And that was the starting point, and I started to pay attention to things that I never really liked before or feared before, like, for example, insects, right? Disgusting, like, ugh. But then I started to learn to appreciate them and their role in ecosystem, like caterpillars, millipedes, and bees and wasps, and and I learned to have an appreciation for all of these creatures.
Mm.
And then as the pandemic went on, I think in 2021 there was some really extreme weather patterns, at least in my limited lifetime, you know. Um, so when I was after the lockdown, there was a period of time when I had a full-time German course, and I used to cycle 30 minutes down this river um, to another part of the city for my German class, and it's a beautiful scenery, right? Like, I mean, it's not some like wild river, but there are fields, and in spring they will be covered with flowers in different colors, and then the trees are blossoming, magnolia, beautiful pink and white, and there are rivers flowing, and there are swans and rivers and geese and all of that. And I was really enjoying that, and every day it made me feel like, wow, this is a beautiful world that we're living in. But later that year, as the year progressed, Frankfurt, where I'm in, instead of experiencing this like record heat and lack of rainfall, and then I saw the grass withering, everything was turning to yellow, it was parched, the the river water level was falling, and plants were dying, the insects were dying, and then baby birds were dropping out of their nests, you know, from dehydration. And then to make things worse, in July 2021, there was a flash flood. And I don't know whether you guys hear about it. There were
Mm.
floods in two German federal states, like North Rhine-Westphalia and Rhineland-Palatinate. And nobody expected this, right? It was so shocking. Not like everybody in Germany was shocked because this was not a problematic area that was, usually affected with flooding. It is just, and it just came and caused a lot of destruction, and it really made me question my future once again, because
Mm.
I was in this bubble, and I was thinking climate change is going to affect those people far, far, far away. We're in Germany. Germany is temperate weather. In fact, we live on a little hill, so even if there's anything happening, we will not be affected. We can continue doing whatever we want. But the reality is that is not guaranteed anymore, right? That is not guaranteed anymore. And that was a turning point for me because I see that the things that I've come to love are so heavily affected, and I wanted to do something to protect them.
Victoria, what an incredibly refreshing take on your journey into building a sustainability focused startup. I think I'm sure our listeners, we've spoken to lots of people that work within this space, and I mean, there's commonalities in terms of people saying that typically it's that very personal lived experience that often is the trigger. You mentioned your lovely bike ride down the canal and the impact that had on you, and then the impact of seeing the sort of decline, if you like, of that through the droughts that you then experienced, and then the flash flood. That rings true to a lot of the conversations we've had. But I think it's so refreshing that you acknowledge that actually, when it came to your intrigue into gardening and then into sustainability, etc., it very much has come from a personal perspective. And how
Yeah.
can you support and nurture your family and protect your family, and those that are close to you? And I for one think that's incredibly refreshing because it's real. Like that, I think that is true for a lot of people. You hear about impact a lot. People talk about impact and wanting to have this grand impact. Well, the most important impact, if we're all honest with ourselves, is how we go about supporting and protecting our own families. So I appreciate you sharing that with us. That's a really honest insight.
Thank you, Charlie. I think many people, maybe not so present in Europe, but probably more so in other parts of the world, they think that climate change and the resulting, I would say, more extreme weather patterns is something that will happen in the next lifetime. So something that will affect their children or their grandchildren, right? But I don't think so. Especially for people our age, they are going to experience it in this lifetime.
Mm.
So I think there's nothing worse than to be of retirement age where you should be enjoying your retirement. But hey, guess what? The world is in such a devastated state that you can't enjoy your retirement anymore, and it's all your fault, right? So I would like to be able to do something about it. Yeah.
That's
Um,
a very that's a Sorry for interrupting, Victoria. That's a very stark sort of experience that you can envisage people going through at the end of their careers, if you like, and reflecting on. I didn't do a lot. I didn't do what I could have done, and ultimately, I've only got myself to blame, which
yeah.
I think is true. I want to ask you though. I want to dive a little bit into. I know we're going to come on and talk about creator and sort of you were getting to the point of describing sort of that segue. But just before we go back to that point, I want to talk about your advertising and marketing career, and in particular, you described how when you were working in Singapore, there was a sense of maintaining the status quo. I just want to pry into that a little bit, like. What do you mean by that? And what in particular roles and organizations were you working with or campaigns were you working on during that time?
Right. So I will have to say the majority of my career is actually in Germany because I came to Germany right after graduation. So
Okay. Went to
but
university in Singapore and then came to Germany
yes,
after graduation.
yes,
Okay. Okay.
exactly.
Mhm.
But I think like when I say maintaining the status quo, what I really mean is if you look at the way our economy is structured, right? Essentially we are measured with a KPI that is based on growth. We're talking about, company revenue growth or profit growth, GDP growth. And they're the only, like, if I'm being honest, the only thing that continues to grow, in a unsustainable way is cancer. So, so yeah, but unfortunately, the system incentivizes this sort of behavior, right? And for example, we know overconsumption is bad, and we try to tell people that overconsumption is bad. But hey, without consumption, the companies basically cannot survive, right? Because their business models are built on like the units of goods sold and also the margins that you get per good, right? Um, and essentially, in a globalized world, we are not just influenced by our own decisions, but we're also influenced by the decisions that other countries, other companies, it can be far, far away in another continent, the kind of decisions that they're making. So it is a very difficult conversation to have, even if you feel like actually, is it really that good to fly so often, right? Is it really that good to, encourage people to buy different types of shampoo and use them simultaneously, knowing that there's no way they can finish it?
Mm.
You still do it. You close your eyes and you do it because how else are you going to get paid, right?
Mm.
So I think it's also something that people are continuously struggling with.
Hmm.
There's no easy solution, right? There are some very brave souls out there, especially on LinkedIn, talking about degrowth, talking about different business models, and it is an extremely, extremely difficult journey. Yeah, and there will be many businesses who will try, and there will be many of them who will fail. I think most
Hmm.
will fail. Yeah, but that is essentially the status quo, right? And
I'm with you.
very difficult to disrupt. Yeah,
And and essentially, and I'm paraphrasing here, and but jump in if I'm getting it totally wrong, but having, being part of the maintenance of the status quo, and working in the kind of traditional models on essentially advertising and marketing, which is all about stimulating consumption, as you've just quite rightly alluded to. You've then got this very personal experience that you go through during the pandemic,
yeah,
realizing the impact of being able to understand how to create food, and then some of the other experiences that you spoke about. What happens next? Like, when is that very brave moment I know that's coming, where you decided, no, I don't want to be part of that maintenance of the status quo anymore. I want to do something more impactful, and obviously what you then came on to do with Curator. So just to describe to us the sort of next steps that you went through there.
yeah. So um, I think for me, I was sort of waiting. You know, I think there was a period of time when I had a bit of like paralysis
Hmm.
because suddenly you see the problem and then you realize, holy shit, the problem is so big. And
That is a brilliant headline, Victoria. That one, you are a headline machine. That was absolutely fantastic. I think you couldn't have
yeah,
said it more clearly and plainly if you tried. That was brilliant.
yeah, I mean, you're like, there. How? What can I do? You know? And I know that I'm not the only person because I even read a book recently, and this book was written 10 years ago. It was by Naomi Klein. This changes everything, and she was talking about exactly the kind of sensation that I experienced. Right? Because you see it, you feel helpless, and therefore you continue to bury your head in the sand, and then you try to continue as if this doesn't exist, you know. um but then one day a friend called, and he was like, "Hey, Victoria, I have this startup idea. Would you want to join me?" And he told me that, yeah, the startup is about sustainability technologies. We want to build a marketplace, and I'm looking for a CMO. Would come join me, and then I see that as a really coincidental entry point. Is almost like fate is calling, right? So I quit my job in advertising and decided to make a dive. Yeah. Um, but through this 1+ years, almost 2 years of being in this startup, I realized one thing. I realized one thing, and that is you really don't have to set the barrier of entry so high to do something for the climate. You know,
Hmm.
you don't have to start a startup, right? You don't have to start a startup specifically in sustainability tech to do something about the climate situation, because
Hmm.
each of us have the duty to educate ourselves, to make the right consumption choices, to understand what is at stake, to vote for the right people, yeah, and support companies who are trying to do the right things.
Hmm.
So yeah, so I,
And Victoria, it's a brilliant and well said, shall I say? First of all, I think taking on that personal responsibility is obviously key. It's fascinating. We've spent a lot of time on the show talking about sort of systems change, and the need for sort of things to be evolved at that kind of macro level. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right that there's a part to play from every perspective. I just want to ask you about that experience of. I think it's fascinating when you speak to founders of startups, and I had a guest on yesterday talking about this as well. Like, what was it like going for you from working in advertising land, I presume for a fairly large established organization, and then going into startup space? Like, what was that like? And did the fact that you were working on something that was sustainability focused and likely to have a significant impact from a climate point of view, did that influence that experience for you at all?
yeah, and so having a startup or running a startup is very different. The kind of things that you're learning in the job is also extremely different from what you would experience as an employee, of various sizes. I mean, organizations of various sizes, because everything is super hands-on, right? So just talking a little bit more about the operational aspects. So I came from advertising, and most people who are not in advertising, they would just lump this together with marketing, you know. But it's really a very, very long kind of supply chain within marketing itself,
Mhm.
right? And advertising is just one part of it. But I found myself having to do everything from designing brand elements, and I became a designer, a graphic designer. I became a copywriter. I became a website designer. So the things that you see on curator.com, I make that myself, right? Um,
That's, I have to say, that is very impressive, Victoria. Because I have to say, and we'll obviously provide links for people to go and check out what you guys are doing on online materials. But the website design and the branding design for Curator are absolutely beautiful. So kudos to you. It's brilliant.
I have to give credit to our brand design agency, Loja. So they created the initial designs for the brand, including a logo, but everything else is, website, like how this is structured, the template, the copy, the graphics. Yeah, I make that. So,
Very impressive.
and like video editing, if you go on my LinkedIn profile, you'll see some videos of me. I was super uncomfortable with LinkedIn before, because when you're working in advertising, essentially you are sort of bound by certain confidentiality clauses. You're not so you can't really talk so much about what you're doing for the client.
Mhm.
So many people are not on LinkedIn, right? So I was never on LinkedIn, and having to put myself out there was a big challenge. Um, yeah, I still don't really know exactly what to say. I think it's only slowly coming to motion. But like video editing, for example, it's also something that I never had to do. But now I'm pretty comfortable using the software. I mean, I use primarily CapCut, and I also do recordings for interviews with another tool. You guys use StreamYard. I use a Riverside, for example. Yeah, so
Mhm.
all of these things, right? Like everything that you want to put out there, you sort of have to do yourself, and it's a very different experience. And you have to a certain extent autonomy, um, and but also with that you have full accountability. So you're responsible for what kind of impact you make.
Mm.
And the reality is, and this is something that I would like to emphasize again and again. Just because you have good intentions does not mean that you will make a good business.
Hmm.
Yeah, you know, like
Indeed.
and this is true for all sorts of businesses. Like we want to have an impact, but it doesn't mean that we will have an impact.
Mm.
There are so many things that go into building a business that will ultimately decide whether you work as a team or not, right? So yeah, so that is one key takeaway for me, and also I've come to realize that sometimes we are so attuned, especially when coming from white collar jobs. We're so attuned to looking at the world uh, from a sophistication lens, right? We think of businesses that we want to be in as things that have to be very sophisticated, you know, and we think of the impact that we want to make as something that has to be tremendous, right?
Mm.
But the reality is, impact can be very direct, and even if it's small, it can mean a lot to the person receiving that impact. So,
Mhm.
so I also, in my free time, I volunteer for other organizations that are not for profit, because I feel like I need this direct connection. I need to feel that I'm making a direct impact, and not just like something that is up in the air, or CO2 emissions. It's not very visible. It's not very tangible, right? And having that touch, be it with animals or nature, it grounds you and reminds you of why you're engaging in certain activities. So now I'm engaging with this pigeon rescue.
With the what? Sorry, Victoria. Would you mind just sitting forward just slightly on your mic? That would be helpful.
Yeah,
Pigeon. You say pigeons?
pigeon rescue.
Oh, fantastic!
Pigeon
Fantastic.
Rescue, they are like a not-for-profit club in Germany. So I'm helping them with some social media, and also helping them doing some egg swaps. So as a form of population control for the pigeons in the cities. Yeah,
Awesome.
so that's what I do at the moment, and I also provide free marketing and business consulting for small businesses, but in exchange for a donation to biodiversity or wildlife conservation charities.
Oh, I love that. I love that, Victoria. You're clearly, from all those years ago in Singapore, been footing away the mosquitoes and not being particularly interested in nature. You've come full circle. It's clear and evident. Now, I want to ask you about Curator, but I think we've gone through 26 minutes already of the show, which is not unexpected, considering I knew how interesting your story was going to be. But let's move on for now and focus on the article for this week, and then we'll talk about Curator towards the end. I think
Yeah.
it was a piece in Z Business, which is not a publication I'd come across before, but it's an Indian-based publication from earlier this month. Would you mind, Victoria, just starting off by giving our listeners a bit of a summary of what the article covered, and then
Yeah.
picking out for us whatever the most interesting salient points were from it? I think there was a piece of research included as well. So over to you. Just give us a flavour.
So, sorry. So the article is essentially talking about a survey that was done, and it says in the headline, over 60% of sustainability startups call for increased governmental support to boost funding and segment. And it talks about who participated in the survey. So essentially, these are startups from different sustainability startups, like clean tech, EV, green hydrogen, solar power, other eco-friendly brands, green startups, environments, advisories, consultancies, climate change warriors, and green finance companies. And essentially, it talked about the kind of support that the startups need, and touched very, very slightly on why the support is necessary, right? Because there is, green research and development that is very intensive in these industries, and without sufficient financial resources to innovate, it will not be able to succeed. And yeah, so that is essentially what the article is saying. And in order to reach the 2050,
2070, I think it was, wasn't it?
2070, yeah, net zero goal by 2070. So in order to reach that, India has to find a way to boost the green sustainability startup sector. Just 1 second, let me drink some water.
Bless you.
Mhm.
Do you know
Yes.
what? I'm going to do exactly the same while you do that. Sorry, Victoria, go on.
Mhm. Yeah, so that is what the article is essentially saying. And yeah, I would have to say, this is an article from India, but the reality is very much similar across the world. So in Europe and US, we have less visibility into China, but the startups are facing exactly the same issue. Yeah.
I think that was literally going to be one of my first questions, you, Victoria. Was in your estimation, is this a commonality across the rest of the world? What in particular, when we talk about the issues that startups are facing, sustainability based startups are facing, can you just provide our listeners with a bit of clarity around what, in your experience, are the main issues that are at foot with how those businesses are growing and developing?
Um, well, I would like to zoom in a little bit more on climate tech, right? Because there are a lot of, I mean, things like like sustainability consulting, or like green financing. There are, or like carbon accounting softwares. There are some of these sectors that are actually booming right now because of regulatory requirements.
Mm, mm,
I want, I don't want to talk so much about those, but climate tech, climate tech, regardless of where they are in the world, they face very similar and very unique challenges. And I will start with this, right? So I recently read an article on McKinsey, and they were talking about the capital intensiveness of climate tech.
mhm,
And there was a statistic that was very interesting, and it was the ticket size. So, how big is the ticket size of for venture capital for climate tech companies versus other high tech uh, companies like quantum mechanics, quantum computing, or fintech?
mhm.
Do you want to take a guess how much bigger the ticket size is for early stage VCs for climate tech technologies versus fintech and computing?
I've got absolutely no idea, Victoria. And if you wouldn't mind, when telling us, would you mind clarifying exactly what the ticket size means and refers to within the context of venture capital?
Right. So typically, when a startup goes like is raising funds, they will need. I mean, depending on the kinds of investor mix they have, they usually would like or they will need to have several investors coming together to reach the fundraising target for that fundraising round, right? And there's like the amount of money that the investors pitch in is a ticket.
Hmm.
Yeah. So the higher the ticket, or the bigger the ticket size, would just mean that the more the money the VC will have to put in.
Hmm.
Yeah. Um,
So
yeah.
how
So
so how much bigger is the typical ticket size of a climate tech startup than fintech or any other type of high tech startup?
five, 5 to 6 times.
Wow.
Yeah, 5 to 6 times. So that is quite a lot. So as you can see from here, right? Like you have these high growth, high tech companies, and then you have climate tech, right? And climate tech is inherently very capital intensive. Yeah, and why is this so? They need a lot of R&D. They need to have hardware development. They need to set up labs, plants. They need to create or buy industrial machinery. All of them require a lot of upfront capital, right? So we're talking about technologies like carbon capture, advanced batteries, green hydrogen production, right? You can't do any of them without heavy upfront capital investment.
Hmm.
And then so that is what is making them so capital intensive, right? But there is other problems that come along, like these technologies are not typically mature technologies, so they're emerging, which means that there's a lot of refinement that is still necessary. And this creates two further effects. The first one is scaling. They have a hard time scaling because laboratory conditions are quite different from actual deployment conditions. And there's a lot of testing that needs to be done to ensure that the product itself can reach that commercial scale. And also the companies that are buying these technologies, they don't just buy they don't just buy and then it magically works, right? They need to somehow integrate this into their existing infrastructure. So there's also investment on their side. And essentially, this makes scaling more difficult. And what happens when scaling is difficult? The products are expensive. Yeah. And so there's usually some sort of price premium that is associated with climate tech products. The most obvious being, for example, sustainable aviation fuel and or green steel. Right? You essentially get the same thing. It's not like the plane is going to fly faster with this called aviation fuel, but it's more expensive. Yeah, and so from what I've observed is that these climate tech startups very often find themselves in a chicken and egg situation because, in order to drive costs down, they need to scale up. But because they're expensive, they don't get that many customers. They don't get money customers or commitments or offtake agreements. They cannot scale, and if they cannot scale, they cannot bring the cost down. They cannot compete on pricing. So in the end, it is a very tedious, difficult, challenging journey for climate tech startups in general. And this is across the board, right?
And Victoria, what's the? And by the way, that was beautifully described and clearly defined. So thank you for that. What are the solutions? I mean, is it as simple as being able to position the potential long-term return of these climate tech startups getting it right, understanding that it's a difficult journey, but the opportunity for return being so significant, or is it down to, I think, as the article alludes to, governments and regulators and policymakers getting more involved in order to support the space? Like, what's your take on how these issues are resolved?
Yeah. So when I read the article and it says 60% of the climate tech startups ask for more funding support from the government, I was like, what is the other 40% thinking?
It's so true. Yeah, so true.
Because as you can see, right, like from a private industry, financing perspective, it is climate tech's not always very attractive. Right? There are some exceptions, but if there are alternatives who guarantees more return or higher growth potential, then chances are, the private the capital is going to flow to these guys instead, right? And and essentially, like because these problems exist and they snowball, uh, they they require governmental interference or support. And why is that important? Because climate tech is in a very special place, right? They are private. They are essentially producing private goods, but they have public ramifications. They are a weird beast that is mixed between private and public goods, and essentially, in order to survive, we need to have these climate tech deployed. And I think it's also in the same article, the McKinsey article that I read. It says like 40, I think it's about 40 to 45% of. So we will need to. We already have 90% of the technologies that is required to reach our net zero goals,
Wow.
right? Society,
Mm-hmm.
but I think only 10% of them are like uh, commercially commercially ready and mature.
Right. Wow.
45% they are like commercially available, but they're not mature, so they're still emerging, and
Mm-hmm.
which means that there's still a lot of research, a lot of development that is necessary. Like these are essentially technologies that we have to use if we even want to get to the net zero goal, right? So it sits in a very important space for human survival. So governments have to intervene somehow, and yeah. So this is the a key solution really is government intervention. Yeah.
And Victoria, how? Because it's very nice to sort of envisage a sort of just a call to arms, if you like, for the world's governments to start investing more into this technology. And I think you described that so interesting. That from what you've suggested, that means that 45% of the technology which is currently available to contribute towards us realizing our net zero ambitions is not commercially viable. So there's a huge opportunity for governments to get involved. What is it that what is it that's stopping governments, do you think, from investing in this way? And I know that's a massive generalization, but just touch on that. Like, why don't they? Is it just purely short termism and the fact that there are more pressing things to address across the globe currently?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. There are economic, I would say, situations. I think when it comes to keeping jobs versus um, investing in the future, right?
Mhm.
I think most governments are incentivized as well to make sure that the economy is growing, and that takes precedence. And also rightly so, right? If you're worried about whether you're going to have your next meal on the table, chances are you're not going to think too far into the future. And you just have to look at how the US election went down recently to understand that, where people's focus are right now. So to answer your question more directly, what is stopping governments from, taking up like even more active role in supporting these climate tech startups? Is really politics, is interest, is lobbying, it is power, and it's also a bit of I mean, this is very strong in the U.S. Trump camp. They Some of them don't even believe that human actions are leading to climate change, or they don't believe that climate change is so drastic. Yeah, so yeah, I think that affects in turn a lot of the policies that are being put out. Like Trump, for example, has already promised that he's going to do reversals in policies, right? He wants to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. He wants to roll back environmental protection. He wants to suspend funding, for the Inflation Reduction Act. So I think, the political climate, economic situation is very, very, they are very, very influential on governmental support for climate tech.
And I suppose ultimately, Victoria, it comes back full circle to a comment you made earlier about our individual responsibility and the things that we can do in order to influence, some of these issues on a wider scale. And obviously, who we vote for and who we choose to be our governments is a key part of that. As expected, we rattled through 40 odd minutes already, Victoria, and I've got to ask you the magic one question. But before I do that, I just want to, you've spoken so beautifully about the state of play and how, clean tech, in particular, startups within the sustainability space are looking to address some of these fundamental issues around funding. Just give our listeners a flavour of what Curator actually does as a platform, because you've been brilliant at staying clear of that. But let's just give them a flavour of what you guys actually do.
Yeah, so Curator.com is we are a platform, a B2B platform that helps companies scout sustainability technologies. So, to give you a more tangible example, if let's say a recent case that we just did, a company is looking for a nuclear reactor, right? They are looking for a nuclear reactor that is in Gen 4 with a specific output capacity and that has a specific use case, so marine applications. And this is not something that you can find very easily when you just Google, right? And the current conventional step that most companies do is to employ consultancies to do that, specialized consultancies. But guess what? The consultancies are going to have to Google, because there's no tool that is available for them to come to these like list of suppliers very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So what we do is we take a lot of data. So we have about a data for about 500,000 companies in our database. We develop machine learning models, and we also have our own taxonomy. So taxonomy is like the categories to which different sustainability tech can be categorized, and we use these machine learning models to basically um, very quickly classify the information that we have, so that they are much easier to be found, to be organized. And then based on the client criteria, we then help them create a short list based on what is most relevant for them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We can do that all in 10 days. So this is what we do.
Fantastic, Victoria. I love that. And I think aligns perfectly with, I guess, one of the things that came out of the article around, the need to one of the things that we can contribute towards addressing some of these issues around, as you described, the uptake of the sustainability options, if you like, for organizations, is to make them accessible,
Yeah,
and easy access. And what you guys are doing perfectly aligns with that. So yeah, big fan of what you guys are doing at
thank you.
curator.com. And again, we'll link to the site so everybody can check out the beautiful branding and obviously the great work that you guys are doing. Victoria, I'm going to conclude though with the magic wand question. I'm fascinated to know where you're going to go with this. But if I was to hand you a magic wand and you could change one thing about the commercial business world this instant, what would that one thing be?
I would change the financial incentives of upper management, so the executive boards for big companies, so that they're aligned with long-term goals rather than short-term performance.
What a beautiful, what a very very sensible and beautifully described magic wand suggestion. I couldn't agree with you more. I think I think applying that, in all honesty, we've already alluded to it when we talked about governments as well during this conversation. Just the more long term thinking that can be engineered through the way that we set up our systems and the way that we set up our incentives, etc., throughout different modes, if you like, within society, I think is a great idea. Brilliant suggestion, Victoria. Let's see it implemented. Thank you so much for agreeing to join us again this morning. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, Charlie. Thanks for having me.